I want to say just a word about Ligare, the organization that I've started with a lot of help from a lot of people. And it's the word Ligare is Latin. It means to bind or to join. It's where we get the word ligament. It's actually the root word of religion. And even in classical times, it was sometimes used to describe the union between the human and the divine. So I think it works. I was pretty surprised that ligare.org was available, so I snapped it up a long time ago, well, before I did all the legal work. So I'm grateful for that. So ligare.org is the website. It doesn't have a whole lot on it. Actually just has sign up for the newsletter. We're building the website based on the input that we're getting in these kind of meetings. So we're doing that as we speak, and there'll be more and more content on that and listings for events. But right now, if you're not part of that newsletter sign up, please do that if you're interested, so that you can keep track of us and we can let you know what's going on. I did this and asked for help with this because in 2016, I was in a study at Johns Hopkins, and there was a parallel study at NYU, religious professional study. Those of us in leadership in the world's religions, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and with the requirements were that you were a leader in a Christian setting or a religious setting, and that you were psychedelically naive, which is to say that you had not used psychedelics before. And there were about 25 or 26 of us in those two sites in that study. I'm in touch with half of those right now, just Christian and Jewish, and we're meeting once a month for us to get to know each other. And the study will be released. Last word I heard was early in 2022. So in the next few months, and my hope is that this network, both those of us in the study and many of us, including you, will be sort of like my network of mycelia, that we're down here just below the surface doing our thing. And when the conditions are right, up pop the mushrooms, which is people very conversant and excited about the possibilities, both for mental health and for religious life and for this health of the whole cosmos, not just people. So that's a little bit about me. The study was my participation, 2 medium-high doses of psilocybin at Johns Hopkins with 2 amazing people as my guides. And I had a very profound experience both times, very Pentecostal, which is unusual for an Episcopal priest, but I was grateful for that. And later talked to Pentecostal friends of mine who were not surprised at all about any of that. And it was very affirming for me of the presence of the Holy Spirit in the world and in my body as the current that drives it all. So I had many insights about that. And that's what we're going to hear from our 2 panelists. I want to first introduce Rita Powell, who's a chaplain at Harvard. And I'll let her say a little bit more about herself and her work, and then her participation in the study and where that's leading her and has led her in her ministry. So Rita, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks. Nice to see, as Hunt said, some familiar faces and names and some new names. And I appreciate the opportunity to sort of talk and think with you. I will share a little bit about my story, but I am very curious to know, for those of you who are here, I'm curious to know what questions are driving you in this. So please do, from my perspective anyways, please do drop things in the chat for us to chew on together. All right, so my story, a little bit of it. I came into religion in general. I came into Christianity primarily through bodily ecstatic practices of a variety of sorts, but mostly I was an athlete. I was a very serious, high school and then college athlete, and had multiple significant transcendent experiences in the course of those sports. And then, so as an undergraduate, I was trying to make sense of that. And so my whole entry into religion comes from thinking about how the body is actually a site of transcendent experience, and how it is that practices which particularly cultivate somatic and body awareness, endurance, discomfort, are also able to sort of launch us periodically into these places that are real places, but that seem like a different place than the place that we were in, and simultaneously the same as that. Okay, So that's great. So I find my way into religion and into Christianity largely because for me, the idea of the incarnation mapped perfectly onto what I had and this is my idea of the incarnation, mapped perfectly onto what I had experienced in sports, which is to say that the body is a site of divinity. The presence of God is able to be inside of this flesh. And so then I thought, well, this is the right religion for somebody who's really looking to hone practices that get us from the body, kind of out of the body and back around the bend, something like this. This is important background because my drive as a minister and a priest has been the continuation of this, the cultivation of different kinds of practices that allow different kinds of bodies, body types, different kinds of people to have access to a kind of transcendent reality. So that simply put, so that one's life can be more expansive, so people can have a bigger access to their own lives and their own bodies. Now, that's all great. And I have pastored in a number of places. I spent several years out in South Dakota, and then came back to Boston. I'm originally from Massachusetts. I came back to Boston, and I love the Northeast deeply. I'm a diehard New Englander, but also because of that, I can also afford a little critique of the culture of the Northeast, which is, even when it is invested in sports, which it is in certain ways, can tend to the disembodied, can tend to the rationalist, can tend towards a view that prioritizes a kind of limited material view of the world. So I came back here, I came to the church in Boston and realized that even inside the context of people living faith lives, that the pursuit of the transcendent was seen as something self-indulgent and unnecessary. So I was confronted with a religious context in which, by and large, religion's value was to be seen exclusively in its kind of ethical form. So and that's fine. I'm also for ethical pursuits, but it felt to me that it was an increase in intensity in my ministry to want to really seek ways to encourage the pursuit of the transcendent as part of the spiritual life. So it was in the context of that pastoral work that I stumbled upon Michael Pollan's article in the New Yorker in 2015 about psilocybin and the way in which it had the ability to crack people out of a kind of limited materialist worldview. And I thought, this is interesting. And when I realized at the end of that article that it was possible that they were looking for religious professionals to experiment with this, I thought perhaps this was a call upon my life. So that's a lot of background, but the reason I give you that much background into the study is because that's also what has really continued to shape me and drive me after the study. So in 2015, I was, like Hunt, I was a participant in the religious professionals study with psilocybin at NYU. And without going too much into the content of the experience, I can share that it was an experience that was of a kind of a non-experience, a kind of an abyss, a kind of a no thing, nothing kind of an experience that was really intense and had no content to it, such that I came out of it very surprised. I read the Michael Pollan article. I heard other people's stories. I thought I was going to see like fairies and butterflies and experience a unitive love and divine consciousness. And what I got was absolute nothing. And I thought, have I done something wrong? Did we get the dosing wrong? And after the study, what my guides sent me actually to the tradition, to the Christian tradition, to a pocket I hadn't encountered in my time at seminary and as a faith leader, which is the whole apophatic tradition, the whole tradition of negative theology, of precisely an experience of God, which is absolutely nothing. So the experience itself delivered me into a place in my own faith that was really interesting. It required me to then go back into the world of religious studies. By a stroke of Holy Spirit, my life also turned in the midst of this, such that I'm now the Episcopal chaplain at Harvard. So I went from a parish now to a university context, where it's very easy for me to find ways to spend some time now digging into this part of the mystical tradition. And that investigation into religious studies and this negative mystical tradition, negative theology, mystical tradition of the abyss, as it were, has been really significant for my integration of this experience. All right, so the last thing I'll say is just kind of where we're at now. And as I said at the beginning, I'm still in the same place in many ways, which is filled with curiosity now about what are the ways in which psychedelics might productively be used as a normative part of the Christian life, both for the purpose of a kind of therapeutic value of breaking up a limited, materialist worldview, which was my initial pastoral desire and intent. And also as a part of the religious life, as a kind of aid to contemplation, as a kind of entry into the riches of our own tradition, in fact. And so I have a lot of questions about how to do that well. And I don't think it's entirely a simple proposal or proposition, but that is, those are some of the things I've taken with me, and I'm still sort of pursuing and curious to see where we can go with how to land these experiences inside the study of religion, kind of what we know of our own traditions, and how to move forward with thinking about uses as part of the spiritual life. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening to all of that.
Thank you, Rita. I think, and we're going to go to Dave in just a second, but I think it's so important to remember that it's not just rainbows and unicorns and unitive experiences in the spiritual life, regardless of psychedelics, that there's a fullness to it that does not just include the light. It does. So, and I think there'd be a problem if psychedelically occasioned mystical experiences only included unicorns, rainbows, and unitive consciousness. I think that it would be a sign that maybe it's not as what we think it is. So thank you. I'm sure that was not easy, and I'm sure it continues to be a challenge. And so that's an important perspective on this, and a really important one. So thank you. And we'll have a discussion again. Please, if you're just joining us, know that we'd love to have your questions in the chat box. It helps us know what we need to be doing as educators in this, and people that are going to be talking about this a lot in the months and years ahead, to know what the questions are and what the concerns are and what the hopes are. So please drop everything you'd like to in the chat, and we'll try to answer those questions, but if not, we'll follow back up. Now I want to move the conversation over to Dave Barnhart, who is a Methodist pastor and a church planter, and also a teacher, a university teacher in Birmingham, Alabama. And I'll let him take it from there. Thanks, Dave.
Hi, thanks. I forgot what actually we're talking about, how we got connected to the study, how we got brought into this. Okay, all right. Rita, thank you for sharing. I wanted to say, before I talk about my own thing, your question about how we integrate this into Christian faith. I was just reading 2 Corinthians the other day, and Paul really downplays mystical experience. He's like, I could talk about going to heaven and hearing angels talk, but we're not going to talk about that. And so I think it's interesting because he introduces this ambivalence about those kind of out-of-body spiritual experiences to say, we're really going to emphasize the practical things, loving each other, being in community, and we're not going to talk about. Anyway, I think it's an interesting, I think there's a real theological tension there that we'll have to wrestle with. I guess it was probably 2015 or 2016 when I first heard of the study. I had planted a church, and I guess the 5th year of church planting at that point, and was exhausted, feeling a little burned out, but also seeking direction, seeking clarity. And I remember praying for discernment, for direction, and sort of the word that came into my head was vision quest. So I said, okay, God, I need a vision quest. And it was like that week, a colleague sent me an email with a Johns Hopkins flyer on it, saying they were searching for clergy to participate in this magic mushrooms thing. And I was like, okay, answer to prayer. I guess prayed for a vision quest, and this thing like came across my inbox. At that point, I called. They weren't taking people from outside of Baltimore, and but I talked because I'd always been interested in the neuropsychology of religious experience. I grew up in a counseling household. My dad was a mental health counselor, but we had often talked about spirituality and mental health and that kind of thing. So, the idea of I knew some of the brain science behind religious experience, like the stimulating the parietal lobe gives you a sense of presence. The part of your brain that's responsible for distinguishing between yourself and the outside world, when that gets suppressed, prayer or contemplation, you have this, Freud called it this oceanic feeling. So that had always been an interest of mine. And so it's like, this is both personal and academic or intellectual for me. I was disappointed when they said that they weren't taking anyone outside of Baltimore. And then 2 years later, I got a call and they said, "Hey, are you still interested in this?" And I said, "Absolutely." So that was in July, and by August I was doing my screening, and then September and October I had my 2 sessions in 2018. And I would say that those were kind of benchmark experiences for me in terms of my spiritual life. My conversion, getting married, a few other mystical experiences, spiritual experiences I've had generally as a young adult. This was a little bit like 6 months of psychotherapy in 6 hours, I guess. The first session I was exhausted and I didn't know if I wanted to do it again. Especially when they said you could up the dosage next time. And I thought, why would anyone want to do that? But after a month, I went back and had the second session, which was for me much more worshipful, spiritual experience. I don't know, Hunt, how much you want me to share of the actual experience. Go ahead.
Like Rita did. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thumbnail sketch. So it really snuck up on me. Because after I've had met with my guides for a month beforehand to get to know them, to be able to trust them. In the session after taking the pill, we chatted for about 15 minutes, and then once I began to feel some sort of spatial effects, like I suddenly felt very tall. They had me lie down, and I put on the set and the eye shades. And I don't know how long I lay there. My guide asked me, what are you experiencing? And I said, well, I'm kind of seeing some paisley stained glass effects. But I thought, this really isn't much of anything. And I thought to myself, if I've waited for this for 2 years and come up for this screening and done this month of interviews where I told my life story 5 or 6 times, if I've done all that and this is what it is, I'm going to be disappointed. And then this sort of question like floated up, like, what would I do with my disappointment? And so then I looked down and I'm cradling my disappointment in my arms. And it was like a baby. I can't tell you what it looked like, but I'm holding it, and I just recognize it as my disappointment with ministry, with regrets of family, disappointment with life in general. And I just wept. It pulled this grief and disappointment out of me in these gut-wrenching sobs. And as I was kind of going through this cathartic moment, I kind of noticed some hovering here, and it was a giant insect-like eye, and I recognized it as God. And God was looking at me through this compound eye, and I could see myself reflected in it. And God was definitely a she. She was a maternal presence, and she was wrapping me up in these sort of concentric circles of her arms. Like I was cradling my disappointment, she was cradling me, and she was just telling me, it's going to be okay. It's okay. And that it's okay to be disappointed. And it was such an incredible relief, because I hadn't realized that in my ministry, I was walking around pretending not to be disappointed, that I was trying to put a brave face on it for my congregation, for my family, for myself. Like I could be honest that I was disappointed with how things had turned out for the church itself as a whole. Like I feel this crisis of the church really letting the world down, and that I hadn't felt like I could just care for my disappointment. And then on the other side of that, I mean, hours or years or lifetimes later, I realized that I was just overwhelmingly grateful for all the great stuff that I do get to be part of and that has happened. And I guess the sort of lesson was that I couldn't be truly grateful until I was truly honest about my disappointment. Okay with that. Now, I don't know, I could have sat across, I mean, I don't know how many times I've sat across from parishioners and said, it's okay to be angry at God. It's okay to be disappointed in God. And I would have meant it. I really would have meant it, but I wouldn't have known it like this. And like now I know it in my bones. And I feel like it really, I mean, it was life-changing. And so I feel like on the other side of that, I've been able to be more honest with myself, with my congregation, with God, with other people. I feel a lot more like I can be transparent and vulnerable, and it's not a bad thing. And so this is, this was 3 years ago now. And I still feel the effects of that. I wouldn't say as acutely as I felt like right after, but I definitely, it has been a life-changing experience. So I'm excited. I'm now also, in addition to teaching, I'm in a program for a master's of clinical mental health, because I would like to integrate psychedelic assisted therapy, which seems to be the more main medicalized way that people are going to have access to this, with spirituality, with connecting it to Christian tradition, like Julian of Norwich and all this. I mean, some of the experiences, I mean, that was one sliver. That was like the first 15 or 20 minutes, and the rest was an epic experience. But to be able to integrate that with our traditions, with our ancestors, which is not language that I had used a lot previously, with understandings of God. So I feel like, I guess, like it's inevitable, and I just want to be part of it somehow. And so that this is the way that I could retool my ministry for the coming century. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Dave. I will say, I want to make sure that everyone's at least kind of has some sense of where this is headed in the culture. And it seems pretty clear that psychedelic assisted therapy is coming pretty quickly, and that the FDA is close to approving psilocybin and MDMA, I think probably for depression and anxiety, PTSD, addiction. That's coming pretty quickly through the usual medical channels, clinical and medical channels. The pharmaceutical companies are interested, a lot of huge amounts of investment in that, because obviously there's a lot of money in mental health. And so that's coming. And I think for me, and I think for everyone on the panel and a lot of other people who have funded this research and have been in the conversation much longer than the three of us have been, a hope is that there's also, in addition to the clinical, of spiritual, religious access and use and normalization of that as well. So that it's not just the clinical, that it's also available for people with end-of-life distress, hospice use, and then for what we call healthy normals, people that are trying to live day to day in a crazy world and trying to keep it between the ditches, that this experience of God, of the spiritual experiences, religious experiences, will be food for the journey and grounding, and will get us through. So this is a much bigger conversation than the clinical, and the religious conversation is just now becoming public. In fact, it's not even that public. And I think the study released will be a part of that. And so let me just ask both of you, kind of, if you could just take a minute to fantasize about where you think this is headed for we're all three of us are Christians. So, and this is a much larger discussion, not just Christian, but in the Christian world, where do you think this is headed, or where would you like to see this headed for us as the church and for Christians and for those that are out in the culture that may or may not be Christian, may not even be interested? So Dave, let me go to you first on that, and then Rita will come to you.
Well, I think and you kind of hinted at this in your opening remarks. I think it has the potential to be world changing and culture changing. I don't mean to be, that sounds grandiose, but the fact is, after my experience, I know that I have a much keener interest in the natural world. I was definitely, I definitely felt that we needed a more ecological spirituality even before this, but that's been shot into the stratosphere for me as a result of this experience and the pandemic. I think lots of people stayed home, started baking and foraging and all that stuff, realizing that the destruction that the capitalist influence on and the religious justifications for our culture are part of what's killing the planet. And so, my hope is that in some ways this becomes a connective event between religious traditions and among religious traditions, for people to be more deeply attuned to what's going on in the natural world. Theologically, I come back to good old evangelical standby, John 3:16. For God so just about human beings and our social world and our economic world. It's God loves everything, and for us that part of if you are from the Christian tradition, part of following in this footsteps of Jesus is to love creation with that kind of intensity. And for me, I feel like that was boosted through my experience. I feel like it gave some flesh to that, and so that's one of the things I'm hoping for the culture. I don't really know. As Rita indicated, I feel like I'm still kind of wrestling with how to integrate that into Christian frameworks, especially in a way that doesn't alienate people who are really bought into the stigma or believe like this is a crutch or something like that. Finding a way to help integrate that into our tradition and use genuine. I think this is a gift from God, honestly. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. That's excellent. Rita, what are your thoughts? What's your fantasy or hopes for this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't really until this conversation right now, I'm thinking about kind of some of the different effects on collective spiritual life of the pandemic, how that suddenly gives a different kind of window onto some of how psychedelics might come into play. That's interesting. I haven't put those two together in quite that way. So yeah, I think, I would really like for Christianity to not only ever be quite so serious, wouldn't it be fun if religion was like a little more fun? So I think my fantasy would be that it would be possible to have some places of play that didn't necessarily have to be freighted with delivering productive outcomes. And, I'm saying this in part because, of course, the good work happening in the therapeutic context is guided by those, and should be, by the way, guided by a desire to sort of measure and look at outcomes. And that's really good and important. I think, yeah, my kind of fantasy is kind of how could we play a little bit with what we know and what we don't know. And I agree. It seems interesting to me, the way that the frame that we participated in terms of the study, is not a frame that necessarily immediately delivers you into the natural world. You're in a hospital room in the middle of a hospital. That's not. So I'd be curious to see what that might, as you said, kind of what that might deliver for communities of faith to think about their faith in the outside world, the natural world. That's interesting to me. The other thing, as I heard you speak too, that I'm thinking a lot about is, as I said, for me, a kind of robust doctrine of the incarnation is my sort of soil, to keep the mushroom metaphors going, from which this makes the most sense. but I'm also really aware of wanting to trust the experiences without overly trying to manage them into a Christian framework. So I think that's another, desire for me in going forward. How can you both authentically start from a location, but actually let the experiences go wherever the experiences need to go, and not worry too much if they exactly track with what we thought they were supposed to track with. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm gonna get to the Q&A in just a minute. I'm real quickly want to hear from both of you about where are the conversations that you're having, and I'll say quickly about mine, but the conversations you're having with either the people you work with or serve, or your bishops or district superintendents, whoever you're talking to about this. I'd like to know how that conversation is going. I'll say 5 years ago, I was in the study 5.5 years ago. I was so excited. I couldn't believe my good fortune. And I told a few people, I told some colleagues, I told some friends, and people, open-minded people. And I got either blank stare. I didn't get like you're going to hell or anything, but I got blank stares and are you serious? You did that? And I would say now the war on drugs has been very effective. And I think most of us have had some overlay of that even if we're open, we still, and like there is the like clergy, really, we that's pretty far out there too. So I would say Michael Pollan's book, and then I think the pandemic, and I think our growing awareness of the environmental crisis, the mental health crisis, podcast after interview with people, articles in New York Times. I think it's a different discussion, and that's been my experience. And one of you's in Boston, one's in Birmingham, so I'd be interested, Rita, what's it been like for you in the context of university, but also just in the people you're talking to?
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced some mixed kinds of things. So kind of, as you said, Hunt, that my first experiences of trying to risk maybe telling a little bit about my experience was met with close to you're going to hell, like pretty strong. And I was also met again with people who I thought would be more likely to be receptive to hearing about it, with a kind of deep distrust of the use of a substance to occasion an experience that should be, this is good old, the Protestant bones in Massachusetts are hard to shake, the kind of, you should have earned it, you should have worked harder for it kind of thing. So I definitely, that voice feels strong. And at the same time, I've also found a very, a lot of interested colleagues from a variety of places. So I definitely have had kind of both kinds of experience. As is often the case, I think the hunger is really there among people who are seeking and going to church or not going to church. So I feel that from the kind of student or community level, from the kind of institutional layer, I'm grateful for Harvard. The Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard is really trying to pursue the exploration of this and trying to locate it in this broader context of religion and spiritual practice. So that's been a very hospitable institutional home. Fun fact, and I can say this because he's been very public about it, but one of the Jewish chaplains at Harvard is also one of the study participants. So that's funny. There's two of us. And so that tells you something there. But I don't think it's entirely a clear path.
Yeah, right. Good. Dave?
Yeah, actually, I was pleased. I'm part of a clergy peer group. So in the Methodist system, we're broken into annual conferences. So I'm in the North Alabama Conference, and I'm in a district clergy peer group. And I actually shared very openly with them about this, and was surprised at the positive response, honestly. Again, part of my impetus was to try to be more honest from my experience. So I've been trying to share boldly where I can. The leadership of my church knows I haven't gotten up on a Sunday morning to talk about it, because I don't feel like that's really an appropriate use of that space. But I've never, I certainly, let me back up. I wouldn't push anyone to do this. Like, I would definitely, I feel like if you feel called to it, then it may be for you. If people who have resisted, I just say it's not for you. I would echo also, I think I've gotten some questions, as Rita said, about people who feel like, is this cheating somehow? earlier I used the word crutch because I think we've used that in some conversation. Is this a crutch? And for a lot of people, it's less like a crutch and more like getting beaten with a crutch, because this can be a really intense experience. And I think about all the ways as religious leaders that we try to set people up for religious experiences, for spiritual or transcendent experiences, from worship, or, people sign up to go on retreats, or they go on mission trips, or, we deliberately do things to increase the likelihood that someone will have an encounter with God. So, I guess when we do find that kind of resistance, part of my tendency is to interrogate that a little bit. Like, do you feel like you got to earn a spiritual experience? Is this an achievement spirituality? I think that's a good question to ask. And on the flip side, I would say to have if you're doing harm reduction, you're doing pastoral care, actually a psilocybin experience is a lot of work. I felt like it was exhausting. Like it was, we did a month of prep work, and then we did a year of follow-up. And I feel like I'm still trying to process everything. I feel like there is a lot of work that goes along with this, especially for integration. And I think especially for, trying to figure out the implications of what I learned for the rest of my life. It's not like I'm taking a pill and, as we said, seeing unicorns and fairies, and now I suddenly have faith. It's a lot more personal than that. At least it was for me. And I feel like that is a lot of work. But I don't want to emphasize like, oh, it is a lot of work, because it's also this gift. I feel like it was just, I gotta say, just remarkable.
I think Dave's frozen there. I'm gonna go to the chat, and if Dave comes back, we'll come back to him. But so the first question we had is, are you describing transcendence? Does it include what comes from our own mind? What comes alive to us in the natural world? What is interjected or intervenes in our lives from outside forces? The catharsis, all of these more. So maybe Rita, since Dave's not on here, this question of just transcendence and coming from our own mind, and a little bit about, is it real? That's not in the question, but I think I've heard that question before too. Can we trust it?
Yeah, that's actually, that's one of my biggest questions of places of curiosity, is to kind of ask, okay, what is being shown in these experiences, and by what agent? But who is the agent here? How does this work? I think, as a person of faith, I'm okay. I think I'm allowed to just kind of start from my own position, which is one that does in fact believe that reality is multi-layered. But it's, again, for me, it's a realization that I think, again, from my own context, the churches I serve have neglected maybe this sounds abstruse, but like have neglected the study of metaphysics, have neglected a way of actually accounting for what's happening in these other layers. I think most people that I encounter have some awareness that their reality has multiple layers to, and we have different ways of accounting for those layers. And one way, even to look at something like the kind of molecular, neurology level, that's still, it's important to notice that's a layer. That's not a kind of definitive reality. So when these experiences happen, and speaking of something like transcendence, it's something connected to, but not quite identical to this, whatever we mean by this. And of course, you've got to start parsing it. And this is the point. Religion has spent huge amounts of time in the course of its life, Christianity has, in trying to parse what are these different places and layers, but that's not really in our current vocabulary. So I feel like that's a really good question. And the question of kind of what is the natural world? What are the persons animating the when we have an encounter with something, the non-human world? Who is that? What is that? And how does that relate to the self? Again, these are thrilling questions which have been part of the domain of the world of religion and religious thinking. But I don't feel like, again, from my own context and tradition, is not something we're super fluent in currently. So, but for me, that's exactly the point. This experience with the psilocybin kind of reopened this this inquiry into where and who and what is the layer of reality that is being experienced here. I think that's super interesting.
Yeah. I'll just real quickly say, I think over the course of my seminary, and it's not anyone's fault really, and then 16 years in parish ministry, I think I flattened it out. I flattened out the faith. I flattened out the tradition so that it was, yeah. So I didn't get into it because I wanted necessarily to study it. I answered the call to ordination because I'd had an experience of God that had very little to do with my mind. I mean, so, like you, it awakened me. In my case, it awakened me to healing in the presence of the Holy Spirit. So, which is not anything up here. It changed how I prayed with people. It changed how I laid hands on people, which was kind of perfunctory before. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that, but and it's not now. I mean, I take it as a transference of energy that's not mine, but belongs beyond me. So that's a totally different way of approaching it now, which leads me to the next question. It's questions about the hopelessness and despair, a sense that we will not make it with a viable future, either socially, ecologically, or equitably. And it leads people to frozen hearts, even among good people, really good people. And this person's curious if these substances might be able to break open people's hearts to a better place for the healing or the healing of all. And Dave, I'll let you take that one if you would. About
Sure.
Yeah, because a little bit about despair and.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I know here in Birmingham, so I live in the Southeast, and I've been involved in social justice type stuff in the Southeast for a long time, and that will make you cynical and bitter as hell very quickly. You know, it's just, I'm in Alabama, you know, people who have been, I have a lot of compassion for compassion for people who feel things so deeply and so rawly, who are involved, you know, who feel like they're beating their head against a wall, in terms of, I feel called to make the world a better place, and yet I feel so powerless, and the wrong seems off so strong, you know. So it can make people exhausted, and I do think, I mean, for me, it has been kind of fuel. It's also been a way to kind of put the brakes on. Yeah, it's a really big world, and I'm one person, and so it has helped me be a little bit more at peace. Because I've also recognized, you know, as it's so hard to change myself. It's so hard to stop my automatic behaviors. How do I think I could stop the world's automatic behaviors? You know, I think that's that piece of changing the world does begin with changing ourselves even. And I feel like I feel that a little more cosmically now. I do hope psilocybin could be used for people who do feel that burnout on the world. Absolutely. I could totally see it re-energizing people. I'll say that I think one of the reasons that psychedelics were criminalized in the 1960s was not because what's the dude name who said turn on, tune in, drop out? I can't think of his name.
Timothy Leary or
yeah, Timothy Leary. I think it wasn't that. I think it's when he said people who do this stuff won't fight in your wars. I think because people, I won't say universally, but a lot of times people come out of this with a sense of, you know, we could create peace if we really wanted to, just by being more peaceful. That's that you come out again. Not that systemic evil and injustice doesn't exist. It's just that there's an attitude toward approaching it that I feel we have to sustain it. Can I tag on, since I missed the earlier question?
Sure.
About transcendence. I think for me, one of the interesting things is, like, you don't, and this, I felt this before I did the psilocybin experience. You don't have a spiritual experience without your brain. You know, that there's something about embodied human experience that we require this massive neurons, not just in our brain, but all over our bodies. So our experiences of trauma and healing and cognition are all there, but that we're always hallucinating. Like, you're hallucinating right now. You have the illusion that this conversation is happening in real time, but your brain is processing it a quarter second after you actually hear the words. You know, the way we construct reality around ourselves all the time, that's actually a trip. I mean, you're having a trip. And I think that's one of the things that for me, that psilocybin helped me almost to get outside my brain and think, okay, so transcendence is really this thing that's happening all the time. And what I've done is I've constructed a reality around myself to make the world more predictable that makes me think this is real when it's not actually. Again, it messes with your sense of yourself and your own consciousness in a way that I think is beneficial. So,
yeah, good. Thanks. That's great. Okay. Next question is really about the role of spiritual directors, which for me, I think it really have an important part. I mean, I think clergy do. I think seminary professors and lay leaders in churches, but I think there may be a particular ministry for spiritual directors. So the question is, it seems like the role of the spiritual companion guide director would be helpful for integrating and processing these experiences into our daily lives. In your opinions, what kind of training or experience would be helpful or needed to accompany folks who are planning to then have and then follow up to a psychedelic experience in a religious context? Either Rita, you want to take that one, or do you have any thoughts about that? Yeah.
No, I mean, I might defer to Dave on this one.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
Okay, Dave, what do you think?
well, I do think, so as I said earlier, we tend to, when we encounter things like this, we tend to want to capture them in a box. And right now that box is like psychedelic assisted therapy for the legalization purposes. But I do totally think that spiritual directors could be part of this. Bill, I think I can say this. Bill Richards was my guide. He's written a book called Sacred Knowledge, where he kind of delves into some of the religious aspects of this. I think it goes all the way back to AA. So the spirituality of Alcoholics Anonymous that has, in some ways, I think been a boon to the church. Recovery spirituality definitely has roots in this as well. And I think spiritual directors could definitely benefit having their own experience by going through psychedelic assisted therapy. The practice of sitting with someone, of being a guide, is really about holding sacred space. It's really about helping, create a container. There's another word that I'm somehow not capturing, but you're doing harm reduction. You're there if someone is feeling distressed, just to hold their hand, to do a ministry of presence. And all of that is definitely within the wheelhouse of people who do pastoral care, spiritual direction. I'm glad to see that some of the trainings for certification in psychedelic assisted therapy are open to people who have chaplain experience. Right. You don't have to go the clinical mental health route. I chose to do that because that's my interest area.
Right. Yeah. I think it's going to be important to have all these different gifts and vocations involved in this, because chaplaincy that's a particular type of ministry, and that's going to be key, especially in the clinical setting and hospice and hospital and that. And then I will say that I think spiritual directors, one of the roles of spiritual directors is to help people integrate mystical experiences. That's how I've used an experienced spiritual director often. So that training is already done for people that are doing spiritual direction. And the add-on is what people are getting who are already trained therapists. They're getting the insight about what happens with the particularities of the psychedelic experience, which are big. There's not just one. It's not simple. But just as therapists have their vocational professional training, and to spiritual directors, there's an add-on. And so I think the clinical model in that way is a good example for how we could use that. And then I would love for there to be eventually that people go to talk to their pastor about this, and the pastor, as we refer people to therapists, we would refer someone to a spiritual director or to a retreat center where people are able to go and have these experiences in a safe and legal setting, and then have it integrated, and then come back to their own communities and have it supported and encouraged and shared. I don't know, that's kind of my fantasy of how this will go, but I think spiritual directors and chaplains are key to how this is going to move forward. So we got a couple more minutes. Let me, a question about spiritual practice. The church and the institution has neglected sharing spiritual practices that go way back. There are ways of opening to the experience of the holy. How would you combine the psychedelic resources with spiritual practices, especially meditation?
Yeah, so I'd love to start on this one. You know, this is part of what I mean when I say I would like, my sort of fantasy is just some spaces to play a little bit. I'd love to see how, I mean, again, I think, well, I don't think, I feel pretty confident that in my own case, some of my personal experience in the study was conditioned by being someone with a very robust daily prayer practice for years, and particularly in the kind of course of leading up to and after the experience. So from that standpoint, I can say that I know I felt that fabric kind of beneath and around me. But that's precisely one of the things that would be fun to try to parse out in terms of practice that's different than the kind of straight up objectives of the therapeutic model, right? But to say, okay, let's see, how does this work in concert with which kinds of meditative or prayer practices? Hunt, you were referencing, I definitely feel like there's kind of some sort of sense of growing energy about some kind of, a retreat center, a place that you could hold these experiences in some kind of way, even in some kind of level of community. And I think immediately a next question is what practices would be going on there to support the experience, and how that feels to me like another place of play. I spent the last year, this is a little bit of an aside, but I spent the last year in the pandemic, we built a kind of outdoor chapel tent at the chaplaincy at Harvard, and spent all this time in outdoor liturgical prayer. Interesting, right? In general, but then, kind of as even has come up in this conversation, well, is there a way to think about liturgical prayer outdoors that would particularly, be a good setting for this? I don't know, just this is whatever. This to me is a place that would be really fun to play with.
Okay, good. Dave, any thoughts about that? The question of spiritual practices and meditation?
Sure. Rita, I think you also touched on the idea of this taking place in community. There's a long indigenous practice of ayahuasca, which a lot of people have, learned about, and there's some problematics involved in that too, because of the way that's being exploited. But I do think the idea of this being working somehow into a communal experience in a retreat setting could be very powerful, especially if there's people on hand to do harm reduction and some kind of. I do think doing some prep work, again, not to make it sound like all work, but I do think meditation, prayer, like you said, Rita, having that background is helpful, so that you're not totally disoriented going in there. There's some level of practice that's kind of like a safety net. And I think being in a ritual environment could be very powerful, and helpful for people.
Right, thanks. I'm going to close. We are going to capture all the comments in the chat box. I just want to honor the time. So we're going to close down. I just put my email address in, and I put in the website for Ligare, which is really just a sign up for the newsletter and staying in contact. So if you're not on that and are interested in the topic, please do that. And Rita, if you could put the Harvard Center for Study of World, I think there are resources there they've done at least 3 or 4 big forums with people that are conversant and smart and bringing both theological reflection to this and psychological. There's a wealth of information